Well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on when you will be tuning in. Thank you so much for joining me here today. My name is Sonia Hernandez. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History at Texas A&M University. Just happy to be doing this talk on Mexican Americans in early 20th century Texas. Thanks so much to the Bryan Museum in Galveston for this cordial invitation, and many thanks to historian Frank de la Teja for setting this up. So I was asked to offer an overview of the Mexican American experience, Mexican Americans in Texas history during the first part of the 20th century. And so there's obviously lots to cover here. But for today's lecture, I want to focus on two main themes with their own sort of set of sub-themes and other major topics, but as a way to sort of manage all of this information. So I think it's really important to start talking about this from a demographic perspective at first. It's really important to know what the community was like. With that, political economy is also really important because it ties to issues like labor, other themes like labor activism, work life, and which was also related to other themes that are really important when we talk about the Mexican American experience in Texas and to be specific, but also in terms of the greater American experience. And so these themes also tie to other questions of civic activism, civil rights, of course, as well as a changing gender roles, gender dynamics that we can see in the Mexican American community as the 20th century rolls on. All this to say that, these things have lots to do with larger developments happening in Texas and the surrounding area. So, Texas at the turn of the 20th century was still a predominantly rural place with an economy focused on small farming, ranching, and in some places an expanding service sector as, the demographics of the state changed. Now, this is about 40, 50 years after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the War of 1846, which was a short-lived war, but quite a consequential war that ended a major conflict between the United States and Mexico. Historians also have used the term the War of Aggression. I mean, this is within the larger context of Manifest Destiny and other developments happening in the 19th century. And the war has also been called La Guerra del 46 or La Guerra de Agresión, if we cite Mexican scholars. So this has just happened. And so when we talk about, to begin our discussion about the Mexican American experience in the early 20th century, we really, as all good historians do, we always sort of go back, right? We go a bit back in time. And so we're talking about a population with, pretty deep roots in what would become Texas. So we're talking about a combination of folks who, did not arrive in Texas as immigrants. They didn't have that migrant experience. While at the same time, as the 20th century would progress, there is a migrant experience to talk about here. And so, we're talking about folks from, that come from an indigenous background, a Spanish background, and certainly a Mexican background as well. I think it's also important when we talk about, sort of this demographic, context, to talk about identity and identity labels. There is really no strong, nationalism tied to Mexican Americanness, if you will. Most folks, whether or not they had been born in Texas, used self-reference like, Mexico, Tejano, Mexicano, Mexicana, and to stress sort of their preference for an identity tied to Mexico, tied to the Spanish language as well. And there is, we talk about Mexican American identity, there is no sort of, there's a claiming of U.S. citizenship, but in terms of sort of claiming Americanness from like the cultural point of view, that really doesn't exist at this particular time period. Now, Mexican Americans would claim, citizenship for other purposes, but not in that sort of cultural or purposes of cultural affinity. I'll talk a little bit about that as the lecture progresses. Certainly after World War I, by the 1920s into the 1930s, and that's of course another sort of chapter in Mexican American history that I won't get to cover. It's at that point where there is this sort of Mexican American identity that is tied more so to the U.S. experience, or rooted in that U.S. experience. But again, that is another sort of topic of discussion. Well, how large was the Mexican origin community in Texas at the turn of the 20th century? This is, the Mexican origin population increased at a remarkable rate. If you look at the numbers, and if you do the math, it's not quite 164,974 people. So I did some rounding off, but just to give you an idea, I mean, these are not precise figures. It's difficult to get at precise figures. But this should give you a rough idea that, we're talking about a population of about, 71,000 or so at the turn of the century, and that by 1930 goes through this remarkable growth. And this is primarily due to a combination of two things, a high birth rate in the community and the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And if we focus on the Mexican Revolution of 1910, I mean, this was one of the bloodiest revolutions of the 20th century compared to other revolutions that had manifested themselves by the first years of the 20th century. We, think of the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. And so the Mexican Revolution is a major development that now, thanks to the work of lots of historians, has taken a more prominent place in Mexican American and U.S. historiography, and certainly also Texas historiography. And rightly so, the Mexican Revolution is one of these watershed moments for many reasons, and I'll sort of go back to the revolution's influence or impact in other areas. But let me just say, for the purposes of understanding this demographic growth, the revolution provoked the migration of at least 1 million people. We're talking about women, we're talking about men, and we're talking about entire families, and many of them made their way from Mexico to places like Texas. And it was quite bloody too. About the same number of people perished in this civil war, which lasted about 10 years. So, you have by the 1930s, this, sizable Mexican origin population, combination of folks who were native to the area and others who had made their journey from Mexico. So it's at, the early 20th century that if we, again, sort of go back to the larger political economic context here, there's lots of change taking place. There's, of course, population growth and other groups that are coming to Texas as well. the growth of railroads connecting, urban centers with small towns, also killing other towns if the railroad did not pass through there. Rising land values, land adjacent to those railroads or railroad stops. All kinds of technological innovations as well that soon fueled the gradual transformation of Texas from a predominantly small scale farming and ranching state to one that would thrive thanks to commercialized or commercial agriculture. And this would happen also in the entire US Southwest. The countryside east of San Antonio, which included towns like Seguin, Gonzales, Kennedy, and Karnes and Karnes County. Those small towns were sparsely populated, while the sort of a more conspicuous Mexican origin community could be found in what were called Mexican colonias, these Mexican colonies, comprised of both Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans. Those could be found in the large urban centers like San Antonio, Houston, and certainly the Rio Grande Valley along the border. Now, these were the three major centers for this demographic: San Antonio, Houston, and the Rio Grande Valley. And by the eve of the Mexican Revolution, San Antonio becomes the city with the largest Mexican origin population in the state, and in fact, the entire country. And San Antonio had also the largest number of mutual aid societies or mutualistas. These were self-help organizations, sort of, what historians have called like the precursor to the labor union. And these mutualistas, were, this was a long honored tradition of mutual aid, of cooperation, collaboration, with deep roots in early to mid 19th century Mexico, and also visible in indigenous communities, where one could also find examples of some type of sort of gender parallel structure, is what scholars have called gender parallel systems of organization, where women and men had separate, different tasks or responsibilities to the community, but with some kind of gender parallel meaning or status, that both their work and their contributions to the community was seen sort of as equal to one another. So all of this demographic change and this Mexican-American community dynamic and variety and diversity, as I'll get to in a little bit, had obviously lots to do with these political economic transformations. And one of the things that is really important to point out, that I oftentimes tell my students, that we cannot ignore the incredible role of the media. And when we talk about the media during this particular time period, we're really talking about newspapers. And so in the Mexican American community, there is this, intellectual tradition quite visible in the growing and the expanding Spanish language press in the Mexican origin community that would make the community much more visible. And that's really important because with this increased public visibility, it gave the community a space to express its varied thoughts, its opinions on a whole, slew of issues. ideas about political movements, issues related to labor, the economic status of Mexican origin people, all kinds of cultural expressions, quite quite noticeable in the various, meeting minutes that often were printed in newspapers, meeting minutes of the mutualistas, for example. There were other issues that were covered in newspapers, like, the educational status, the educational experience of Mexican origin children, and so many other things. When we talk about the Mexican American experience in the 20th century, we oftentimes cast it as a larger struggle for incorporation, for acceptance in the community, and we sort of go straight to civil rights organizations. But I think it's really important to point out the role of the media here and the role of Mexican American intellectuals that were, a powerful mouthpiece for the larger Mexican origin community. This doesn't just happen, at the turn of the 20th century. There's a much longer tradition that had, grown since the days of the journalist and activist Catarino Garza. And so just quickly here, Catarino Garza, and he was certainly not the only one, but I think Garza is a really good example of someone who used the media to express his thoughts about the status of the Mexican origin community. He was also very critical of the status of fronterizos, of border residents. As a bona fide fronterizo himself. He was from northern Tamaulipas, but was very attuned to developments happening on both sides of the border. And he, personified in many ways sort of this this contradiction in terms of sort of the modernity that came along with with the eventual transition from ranching to commercial agriculture, to the growth in industrialization as well, because he sort of took part in this sort of new society, selling, for example, he sold a machine that was in many ways sort of seen as a symbol of modernity, which was the sewing machine. He was a salesman, traveling in northern Tamaulipas and in South Texas, selling sewing machines to making this modern amenity accessible to women from urban centers and rural areas as well. Catarino Garza was also very critical of Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz, who ruled Mexico at this point in time. And this has lots to do with the coming of the revolution. He was one of those early revolutionaries who sought to dismantle the regime of Porfirio Diaz, not from Mexico, but from the United States, and particularly along the South Texas border. And so he's writing about, the need for political freedom, for the political expression. He's talking about ideas about liberalism. He's talking about democracy. He's talking about justice and equality. And so all of those ideas made their way to the press, to the media. And so he had already sort of established, right, this, this critique about, the political inequality, not to mention the problem with respect to little access to arable land that many Mexicanos and Mexicanas, faced at that time. And issues with respect to labor rights. And so this had already been established, sort of that critique had already been established. And so by the turn of the 20th century, you have folks, if we then more carefully look at this particular slide here, with these two Mexican American intellectual leaders. By the time that folks like Pablo Cruz and Jovita Aydar enter the scene, there's this, tradition that has already been established in terms of providing an opening, providing a space for the Mexican origin community to voice its discontent about all kinds of issues affecting the community, sort of locally speaking, but other issues that, that were more transnational in nature. And so you have someone like Pablo Cruz, who established his newspaper El Regidor in San Antonio, and he served as both publisher and editor. And, El Regidor published on all kinds of issues that concerned the community, everyday life, issues, politics. He followed political developments in Mexico quite closely. He was originally from the border state of Coahuila, El Norteño, and would continue to have this deep interest for developments in Mexico, and like his counterparts, like other members of the Mexican origin community. There were thought pieces, editorials about things like immigration, citizenship issues, certainly, lots of coverage of the mutual aid activities taking place in San Antonio and the surrounding communities. And for a short period of time, also Pablo Cruz's newspaper, but Pablo Cruz himself came to support the populist People's Party, which had supported small landowners, not just Tejano small landowners, but also others like German Americans. It made sense because he, like Catarino Garza, was also very much interested in, in expressing discontent against centralized power. And so it really spoke to the larger community with these similar concerns. We focus also on other issues like, voting rights, education. And, the last page of every issue from 1904 to 1915 advertised all kinds of things, including like medicinal remedies that were, that appeal to the larger community. And this is, other goods and commodities that were quite popular among Mexican Americans. So this was a place, right? A real place for the small but very influential Tejano and Mexican American merchant class to reach other members of the community. This is really important to point out to better understand what would come later in terms of, a more robust push for Mexican American inclusion in Texas society. One of the more notable actions on the part of Pablo Cruz was in 1901, and this dealt with a horrific, fatal incident that took place in the central Texas area in Karnes County. And this involved a Mexican vaquero by the name of Gregorio Cortez, who in self-defense shot a white Texas sheriff. So you can just imagine, this is 1901, and if you were a Mexicano, and he was born in the outskirts of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, so he's a Mexican national residing and working in Texas. And so here he is, accused of killing a white Texas sheriff. And, I can spend quite a bit of time talking about this particular incident because I just so happen to be writing a book on the topic. All this to say that it is Pablo Cruz who decides to report almost on a daily basis on, the developments surrounding the Gregorio Cortes incident, and also with some coverage on Gregorio Cortes's first wife, Leonor Diaz, and their children, who, by the way, were imprisoned even after Gregorio Cortes had been captured after eluding authorities for several days. So it's Pablo Cruz who uses the media as a powerful, mouthpiece to defend not only the interests and the dignity of Gregorio Cortes and his family, but does so also as a way to make a larger point about the need to stand up against anti-Mexican violence. And so this is really important because this would also involve mutual aid societies. I just talked about the important role of mutual aid societies, and it's really important to point out that it's Pablo Cruz who also reaches out to other mutual aid societies across the border, and the result was this larger transnational effort that involved mutual aid groups, that involved obreros, working class, Mexicanos, in some cases, Anglo-American lawyers who were sympathetic to Mexican-American lawyers like Samuel Beden Jr., who was also from the San Antonio area with ties to the powerful Norteño family of the Beldens in Nuevo León. And so, all this to say that the media and Mexican-American Spanish language newspapers specifically play a crucial role in giving voice to the Mexican origin community. Pablo Cruz died in 1910, but his wife, Zulema de Cruz, continued with the newspaper's operation up until 1915 in the midst of the Mexican Revolution. And the family not only left that sort of, intellectual tradition, but also the son of Pablo Cruz, Pablo Cruz Jr. would become involved with one of the major Mexican-American civil rights organizations of the 20th century, and that was LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, that was founded in the late 1920s, 1929 to be more precise, and would have a consequential role in the history of civil rights of Texas and the United States. And that is another sort of topic of discussion, and I'll leave it at that for now. Let me turn to Jovita Idar, who was in her own right another intellectual. And like Pablo Cruz, she was a writer. She mostly wrote for her family's newspaper, La Crónica, based out of Laredo, Texas. She was born and raised in Laredo, Texas, and had received training as an educator in Laredo, Texas, at the Methodist-based Holding Institute. And so she, knew about the not only just the educational system and the educational status of Mexican origin children, but she also witnessed firsthand the great inequality that was visible in terms of the gross inequalities when it came to the basic structure of the schoolhouses, resources like books that often were lacking in these so-called Mexican schools, but also sort of takes that experience and turns it around with her participation as a teacher in the escuelitas, or these small schools that were essentially a community response to these inequalities. And this was one way for the Mexican American community to be visible and to play a role in the education of the children in their own communities. Jovita is very much influenced by the Mexican Revolution. I just talked about Catarino Garza as his precursor, and I think Jovita is one of these other historical figures that I think is just absolutely crucial to know about, to better understand not just only the unfolding of the revolution, but to better understand the process of democratization in Mexico, but also in places like Texas. And so she is also very much like Catarino Garza, sort of, caught in this sort of wave of, this new, the dawning of a new society of, things that were considered sort of modern, the coming of the railroad, widespread use, again, as I mentioned, of technologies like, the sewing machine, and many others. And this has to be placed within the larger context of the progressive movement. And we oftentimes talk about the progressive movement in the US, or progressivism in the US, as something that's sort of disconnected to the Mexican American experience. Well, Jovita Haddad is very much a progressive woman, a reformer. And, progressivism had a lot to do with sort of this larger intent to morally uplift the country, reform the country. So you have like a whole series of laws that targeted the improvement, the development of the nation as a whole. And so this is also happening in places like Texas, and certainly happening in the Mexican American community. And so Haddad takes this sort of moment that the U.S. experience of progressivism, but also takes the revolution, the Mexican Revolution of 1910, as to a certain extent as an expression of progressivism with a more sort of transporter character, and uses that to begin to voice discontent about things that were plaguing the Mexican American community, like educational inequality, like the continuing fight for suffrage, for example, and also when it came to issues of violence and labor. So she uses her thoughts, her writings, to voice discontent about the rising anti-Mexican violence that had not just sort of happened, at the turn of the 20th century. There's a much longer history with respect to anti-Mexican violence involving state agents, but also involving just common residents. And so there had been a gross problem with, the horrific practice of lynching in places like Texas and throughout the Southwest, and particularly with, Mexican origin community. And there were, numerous incidents that had taken place, where the newspapers reported on, a lynching that had happened in this town or in this place over here, and it had got out of hand. And it's people like Jovita Haddad and other members of the Haddad family that decide to act in a much more robust way. And they organized a conference. It was sort of the first gathering of Mexican Americans organized by the Mexican origin community to address issues like the problem of lynching in their communities. It, had gone to the point where, even young Mexican Americans, as young as 14 years of age, were found lynched or, hanging from a tree, or Mexican Americans who were suspected of any given crime without even seeing their day in court, were dragged out of county jails, oftentimes with the approval of those authorities in those places, and lynched. And so Jovita Aidar and the Aidar family organized the Primer Congreso Mexicanista that takes place in 1911 in Laredo, Texas, to address issues of the problem of lynching and other forms of anti-Mexican violence in the community, issues of educational inequality, and also the labor conditions of Mexican Americans. And so she also serves as this powerful mouthpiece to the community, despite the fact that she was from an affluent background. She was, had this privilege, right, of expressing her ideas. I mean, and this is quite a privilege, because she's a woman. She's not only a woman, she's a woman of color, and coming from this community that with every passing year was seen as more foreign and more foreign, as opposed to full-fledged U.S. citizens. The lived experiences of Jovita Aidar also help us better understand the labor experiences of Mexican Americans, and particularly the experiences of Mexican American women in labor. So it provides a nice, so her experiences provide a nice window into, another theme that's tied to political economy, and that is labor and labor activism. So official records, don't really tell us the whole picture of women's labor, of the contributions of women, because so many women worked for wages or were paid in kind in what many call the informal sector, not, quote, legitimate workers. But their labor helped to build the Texas economy, and I would argue also helped to build the greater borderlands economy that certainly included northeastern Mexico. Many of them worked in the food sector, worked on cloth making, were costureras, seamstresses, and that's why it's difficult to sort of get at precise stats. But I think we could still sort of provide in broad strokes, a general picture of the labor conditions of Mexican Americans in the early 20th century. Perhaps, before the revolution, maybe about 15% of Mexican origin women in the state worked for wages outside of agriculture. As we'll get to in a bit, the bulk of labor was concentrated, or would soon be concentrated, in commercial agriculture. So about 15% before the 1910 revolution. Certainly by the 1920s into the early 1930s, we could safely say about 25% of Mexican origin women were working for wages outside of agriculture. So they worked in, for the most part, low-paying jobs like the garment sector, laundry work, food processing workers. Outside of agriculture, Mexican American women also worked in, pecan shelling plants of San Antonio and garment factories in places like Dallas, places like Laredo, stores and restaurants in places like El Paso, and of course in farm-related sectors like the vegetable processing plants found throughout the Rio Grande Valley in places like San Benito, Harlingen, Brownsville, McAllen, and Mission, and soon Mission. But women's labor was more conspicuous in agriculture, in farm labor. Whether we're talking about single women, whether we're talking about married women, widowed women of Mexican origin, they could be found laboring in the commercial farms, picking cotton, or other commodities, and in many cases with their children. It's difficult to get to sort of specific wages in this case, because oftentimes women earned wages that they earned wages, but those wages went directly to the patriarch of the family, the grandfather, the father, and in some cases, even the oldest son. But, oral histories, labor records, photographs of the time all form part of this sort of larger corpus of evidence about women's presence in agriculture. And this is really important because when we talk about women's labor, we're talking about farm labor, agriculture, we're talking about cotton. And cotton really in Texas led in terms of cotton production and was a global contender, and in many respects, thanks to the labor of women of Mexican origin and men of Mexican origin. Depending on the season, women could be found, in harvest time in just a single farm. During harvest season, a single farm could employ upwards of 3,000 women at a time to help with picking cotton, picking other crops like berries, vegetables. But oftentimes their labor was seen as temporary or as auxiliary. But their wages were crucial in maintaining entire homes and maintaining entire communities. And as I just said, I think it is important to reemphasize the point that women's labor, even though it was perceived as temporary and auxiliary, played a central role in making Texas a real agricultural powerhouse. And let me just point out, suffice it to say, right, Mexican American men were also employed in large numbers in commercial agriculture. But I wanted to focus on women here because oftentimes we don't really get that part of the larger labor narrative in Texas historiography and certainly in U.S. historiography. But and I'll come back to the role of Mexican origin men in commercial ag in just a bit. The other theme tied to political economy is labor activism. Just quickly going back to Jovita, I mean, this is really important to point out that it's women like Jovita who, despite the fact, again, that came from an affluent family, one could argue she forms part of the very small but growing middle class of Mexican Americans. That doesn't happen until much later, but I think it should make us pause a bit when we talk about class relations. And in the case of Jovita and others, even we can point to Pablo Cruz, that came from a more sort of privileged position. They're still very, very attentive to the needs of the bulk of the working class population of Mexican origin. So there these groups of folks that are of a different class and social background are not very disconnected, as sometimes we sort of assume they are. And so, Jovita sort of sets the stage for, in terms of, women speaking up on behalf of laborers in general, not just women, and sort of talking about the need to organize. And she's also very much influenced by her brother, Clemente Dar, who was an AFL, an American Federation of Labor organizer and active in South Texas and the greater South Texas region. But and this is pretty remarkable because, despite the fact that women had been barred from most labor unions, they're still managing to find a space there to publicly voice their discontent when it comes to labor inequality. So they're doing it by forming their own labor collectives. They're doing it by also through mutual aid societies. and also doing it through the practice of direct action, which was an idea that had become quite popular with the Mexican Revolution in the years leading up to the Mexican Revolution, that found its origins in sort of anarchist literature. And this was a form of worker autonomy and direct action in the form of walking out of jobs and going to protest the various unequal conditions. And one example, and there are several, but just because of time limitations, I want to focus just briefly on one in particular, one activist that oftentimes sort of is talked about within the context of sort of the 30s and into the 40s, sort of the years leading up to what historians call the modern civil rights, Mexican American civil rights movement, leading up to the Chicano civil rights movement. But I think it is important to talk about this particular activist, Manuela Solis Sager, within the context of early 20th century development. So Manuela Solis Sager becomes quite active in labor circles at an early age in South Texas. She was from South Texas early on. I mean, she was a laborer herself, a very different experience from someone like Jovita. And this is important to point out also because there's great diversity and there's great variety among the Mexican American community in the early 20th century. Manuela Solis, before she became Manuela Solis Sager, before marriage, she was a worker herself. She worked alongside her family in the farm fields in South Texas, and she becomes involved with one of the early strikes in South Texas in what Valleyites call the Upper Valley. And she becomes involved with the Onion Strike in the 1920s in Laredo, and she comes from this working class experience. Her father was a miner, and her mother was an educator, but she grows up in this sort of agrarian experience. And witnessed firsthand the depressed wages that farm workers received, and that would continue to receive up until the late 20th century. This is a much longer chapter in Mexican American history that I could spend just a whole 2 hours talking about, sort of the horrific conditions that farm workers were exposed to. And so, I mean, not even when the minimum wage was passed in the 1930s, farm workers were not privy to that. So, I mean, this is a really long struggle, but all this to say that women were also very present in the larger struggle to achieve labor equality. And when we talk about Texas, we absolutely have to talk about, the labor experience and the labor activist experience in farm labor, which was very, very difficult because of the tight-knit network that had been established by Texas growers. And if anyone was caught organizing, whether it was in the small town of Buda or outside of Waco or in the small town of Burkett or outside of, the growing metropolitan area of Houston, you could be, you were very likely to be listed as a troublemaker, and you could find yourself in deep trouble and not being able to secure further employment. And so it's one of these chapters in Texas history that is a heartbreaking, to be quite honest. And but I think it's also important to point out the resiliency on the part of the Mexican American community and women like Solis Sager, who would come to organize what we could call the precursor of the Texas Farm Worker Union. And this was, of course, the South Texas Agricultural Workers Union, which she helped to found in the early 1930s. She was also active in establishing a chapter of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in Laredo, and this is in the 1930s. This is sort of going, beyond sort of the time period that I'm discussing here, but it's really important to point out that women's labor experiences during this time period would serve as that catalyst for women to then become involved in more robust labor activist presence, oftentimes influenced by the writings quoted by the early revolutionaries in the Mexican Revolution, citing writings that made reference to, quote, a dignified way of life, end of quote. And so it's this activist push that would then become sort of the groundwork for the later activism found in groups like the Texas Farm Workers Union and others. I mean, this is sort of just the tip of the iceberg. There's really lots to cover, but I really wanted to focus on the role of women's labor in commercial agriculture and sort of ushering this activist movement for equal rights for themselves, but also for entire families in their communities. Women's labor would then contribute to the needs of a growing demographic. I mean, we go back to the very first slide, the importance of demographic change. And it's important to point out that there are external factors here at play that would place Mexican origin women and Mexican origin men sort of at the forefront of these deeper and long-lasting transformations happening in places like Texas and throughout the US Southwest more generally. And this has a lot to do with the early contract labor laws to bring in workers from Mexico, to import workers from Mexico. And these workers were informally called enganchados. That comes from the root term gancho, which means to hook. So these workers were sort of hooked into a labor contract to come and work for the most part in agricultural work and in other sectors as well, including like railroad work. But I want to focus on sort of the impact it has on the rise of commercial agriculture here. Three major developments sort of have a great impact in the promotion of the early contract labor laws. So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Dingley Tariff of 1897, the Reclamation Act of 1902. And just very briefly here, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 excluded working class Chinese from coming to this country, and not to mention how this government deported many Chinese workers, including Chinese Americans, for the most part, the children of these workers. And so they're excluded as an entire community. And so employers had to find a new major source of labor, not just a major source of labor, but a major source of cheap labor and continuous labor. So that had to be secured. And the Mexicano emerges as the best alternative because of the close proximity to Mexico, because of also the assumption that Mexican workers could be paid less. And so that helps to sort of funnel Mexican men, for the most part, into these sort of unskilled jobs that had been occupied by others like Chinese workers. The Dingley Tariff of 1897, just very briefly here, raised tariffs on imported sugar and thus led to a spike in domestic sugar production, and the sugar beet fields were, required lots of labor. This is in a labor intensive sector. And so you need lots of workers, and Mexican workers filled that need so much to the point that in some places like Michigan, the entire sugar harvest was known as the Mexican sugar harvest. And so Mexican workers are becoming much more conspicuous in commercial ag, and that's really important. I'll talk about the consequences, the long-lasting consequences, in a bit to sort of close. And lastly, the Reclamation Act of 1902 authorized the government sale of public lands in some Western states, and the use of the proceeds from the sales to finance irrigation projects, massive irrigation projects. So similar processes happening along, or I should say, across the border at the behest of the Mexican government. And so this is tied to the larger transformation that historians have termed as the modernization of the United States, the modernization of the borderlands region, the modernization of Texas via industrialization. And industrialization did not only include the proliferation of factories, but it also included commercial ag. The government would work to supply farmers with inexpensive water, or made the access of water an inexpensive one. And this also helped to boost the modern agro system, right? And so it also favored large agricultural enterprises over small farmers. And this project, this massive modernization project, required laborers. And so for the most part, Mexican origin men and Mexican American men filled that incredible need. And all these policies, as I have here at the bottom of the slide here, the consequences, right? All of these developments had consequences and affected the Mexican American community in Texas in very deep ways. It not only fueled, right, the transition from a predominantly ranching and small farm economy to one based on commercial agriculture in places like Texas, but the Texas Mexican origin community serves as a microcosm, right, of this major, larger transformation, because men and women provided the bulk of the labor. And this, again, had real consequences. Number one, by 1920, the bulk of the Mexican American population was basically performing what was called stoop labor, bending over, stooping over, and picking crops in commercial farms and ranches throughout Texas, and certainly throughout the Southwest, where Mexican American women, men, and entire families, including small children, picked cotton, among other commodities, among other crops, many times alongside African Americans, and in some cases alongside poor working class Anglo and German Americans. And this coincides with the loss of land. We're talking about a landless population here, perceived and treated as, quote, unskilled labor, and a population that has very little political representation. So, we're talking about, how the Mexican American community went from a handful of representatives in the Texas state legislature, in the late 19th century up through the early 20th century, with individuals like Tomas Rodriguez serving as a state legislator, to only one by 1919, and that was Jose Tomas Canales, a Cameron County native, trained lawyer from out of Michigan. And so this is really important to point out that as these larger transformations are taking place, we're talking about a Mexican American population that is really landless. The historian Arnoldo de Leon estimates that 80% of Mexican Americans were basically landless by the 1920s. And with, as I just pointed out, with very little political representation, that would be one of the sort of the reasons, the factors that would lead the Mexican American community to push in a more robust way to push for incorporation and civil rights that we see in the next decade by the 1920s. They're up through World War II and on. Number two, so all these changes are helping. They do help to project an image of Mexican Americans as quote, the perpetual or forever foreigner. And this I'm borrowing from other historians who have examined the Asian American experience, most notably the Chinese origin American experience, that this becomes a much graver issue, this idea that Mexicans are foreign and they're only good for cheap labor. This becomes, a much more complicated issue with the coming of the Mexican Revolution, and certainly with the U.S. entrance into the Great War. And why? I mean, these are larger political economic changes that help to cast Mexican Americans as, potential bandits, right? They're suspected revolutionaries. Anyone who looks Mexican, was sort of perceived as as someone who was suspect, a foreigner, and that that also reinforced this idea that Mexicans were only good for labor, and the good for labor. The good for labor only is sort of like the more positive image, and the more negative image is this idea of all Mexicans being bandits, these bandidos, which was obviously not true. And so this is really important because it leads to my third point here is that, I mean, this is all happening at the same time that Mexican Americans are trying to challenge the unequal conditions to which they and their children had been subjected, particularly in the area of education. So there are these early challenges being seen in school districts, and also pushing for political representation. So how do you fight, to say you should be privy to the same benefits extended to U.S. citizens if mainstream media and commercial farm employers view all Mexican descent people as just that, right? Mexican, right, with no distinguishing, with respect to citizenship, and to be more precise, right, as sort of lumped together as just Mexican, unskilled, cheap, and docile or passive labor. So, that's really important to point out. And lastly, this had a lasting effect to this day in terms of not only solidifying old historic ties between places like Texas and northeastern Mexico with the increased migration, the continuous importation of Mexicans for purposes of work, but it contributed to the diverse makeup of the Mexican origin community, because many of those Mexicanos remained in the United States or remained in places like Texas. They had children. This paved the road for a new generation of Mexican Americans. And so, Mexican Americans are a really unique group of people to study because they are both, one of the oldest, the community is one of the oldest groups to inhabit this country. While at the same time, they're also some of the more recent immigrants, right? So it's this really complex, rich, diverse community that we can point to that, has real, roots, deep roots in the 19th century and up through the turn of the 20th century. So let me just go to my last slide here, which is just to share some concluding remarks to wrap this up. I mean, there's obviously a lot more to say during this time period, and hopefully you'll get to hear about these other developments and other contributions from the other speakers in the series. But if I can just sort of sum up here, Mexican Americans in the early 20th century in places like Texas had deep roots in the region well before 1836, well before 1845. And certainly, I think we need to pay attention to late 19th century developments to better understand the more sort of robust, the more pronounced push for incorporation into Texas society and U.S. society that we'll see by the 1920s, 30s, and the later decades. So certainly with deep roots in the latter part of the 19th century, and certainly by 1915, there was a strong intellectual tradition among Mexican Americans via the Spanish language press that helped to anchor it more firmly in Texas society and would help to strongly vocalize opposition to the unequal treatment of Mexican Americans in the realm of violence, particularly lynching, in the realm of education, politics, labor, and other areas. By the 1920s, the community was predominantly working class and residing in these so-called Mexican colonias in urban centers, but also in smaller towns. I think it's also important to point out that Mexican Americans, the Mexican American community was not this sort of insulated, parochial community. The community is very much influenced by and very attuned to larger developments related to labor, the ideas that would come to influence labor activists or expressions of labor activism in the country and certainly in the area. They're attuned to larger developments happening across the border with the 1910 Mexican Revolution. They're attuned to imported ideas of socialism that would come to place workers' experiences at the forefront, anarchist experiences. We could talk about the more radical expressions of labor activism found or evident in the Mexican American community along the border and throughout the state as well. But all this to say that there is great diversity and there's much attention paid to extra local events, and all this helped to shape and make the Mexican American community what it was during this time period. And there are, others that are also laying claim to a dignified way of life by participating in the country's or participating in the first major war of the 20th century, the Great War, or what we call World War I. Folks like Jose de la Luz Sáenz, a Tejano in his own right, who would come to serve in World War I. We have great sort of recovery of this information by historian Emilio Zamora, who actually edited a rare diary left by Jose de la Luz Sáenz. And, it's this sort of claiming belonging, claiming those rights that oftentimes Mexican Americans were not privy to through the experience of military service. And this is sort of another topic of discussion, a whole other chapter in Mexican American history, how Mexican Americans used that experience in the Great War in World War I as a vehicle to then push for civil rights, for the civil rights that Mexican Americans had not been privy to, and this leads to other topics that deserve a whole full hour at the very least, like the emergence of LULAC. But all of these developments have deep roots in turn of the 20th century events that set the stage for the continuation of incorporation of civil rights, other forms of expression for full recognition, including suffrage and more political representation. I hope this brief overview of the Mexican American experience in the early 20th century in places like Texas give you an idea of the dynamic and diverse nature of the community, the issues that concern the community, the long-lasting consequences of the growing participation of Mexican origin men and women in commercial agriculture, not by chance and not because they loved to do that work. It's really important to point out these external factors at play that sort of pushed Mexican origin people into these jobs that were perceived and described as unskilled, but that required a great deal of skill to perform, and it was backbreaking labor. And all of this has deep consequences for the rest of these Mexican American historical chapters in the state of Texas and the entire United States. It's really important to keep all of this in mind, late 19th century developments, early 20th century developments, to get a better grasp, a better understanding of the Mexican American experience in the longer 20th century. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer via email, and the Bryan Museum will supply you with that information. Thank you so much. You guys have a wonderful day.